She feeds a poor old beggar daily. Then comes the shocking truth. Joan Madeline stood frozen on the corner of Tremont Street, clutching a paper bag filled with soup and bread. The same meal she'd brought every day for 3 months. But this time, flashing red and blue lights painted the pavement. 3 police cars boxed in the spot where the old man she fed, Barreto Lozano, sat against the wall, his hands trembling in the cold. A woman in a long wool coat was shouting, her voice sharp and furious. "That's him. That's Barreto Lozano. The man who destroyed my family." Joan's breath caught. Her mind raced. Destroyed her family? The man sitting there was thin, quiet, polite. He always thanked her, always smiled faintly before eating. Now officers were surrounding him, shouting orders, as the woman cried into her gloves. Joan's fingers tightened on the paper bag. Who was this man she had trusted? Why had he never told her the truth about who he really was? What could this homeless man have possibly done to destroy someone's family? Where are you watching from? Comment below and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's story will leave you speechless. 3 months earlier, mornings in Roxbury always began with noise. The thin walls of the old brick apartment carried every sound: barking dogs, blaring sirens, a neighbor's argument. Joan Madeline, 14, had learned to wake before all of it. The tiny bedroom she shared with her 2 cousins barely fit the bunk bed and a cracked dresser, but it was hers. She liked the early quiet, the moment before life demanded too much from her. Her Aunt Patricia, a nurse, worked 2 jobs, one at Boston Medical Center and another at a nearby clinic. Most days, she left before sunrise and came back long after dark, her scrubs smelling faintly of antiseptic and fatigue. That left Joan to get the kids ready for school, fix breakfast, and make sure homework was done. Aunt Patricia always said Joan had an old soul, but Joan just thought it meant she didn't have the luxury of being a child. Her mother had died of cancer when Joan was 8. Her father never came back after the funeral. Sometimes Joan liked to think he got lost on purpose, because facing her mother's empty chair was harder than disappearing. Over time, she learned to stop expecting people to stay. After school, Joan babysat the cousins until Patricia's shift ended. Once the dishes were washed and the apartment quieted, she grabbed her worn sketchbook and stepped into the streets. She walked through Roxbury's cracked sidewalks, past corner stores and faded murals, sketching what others ignored: shadows under fire escapes, an old man dozing by a dumpster, a child waiting for a bus alone. Drawing made the world slower. It gave meaning to the faces everyone else passed by. Sometimes she sold her sketches at a weekend market for a few dollars, money she used for bus fare, notebooks, or a snack for the cousins. Other times she just kept them, folding each page carefully like a secret. On weekends, she took the Orange Line downtown to the financial district. The contrast fascinated her. Towering glass buildings caught the sky while people in suits hurried by without looking up. Yet at the base of those same towers sat people wrapped in sleeping bags, holding cardboard signs, blending into the stone. Joan couldn't stop thinking about how unfair that looked, how one person could spill coffee worth more than someone else's dinner. It was in those silent walks that she began to feel the pull of compassion that would later define her choices. She didn't think of it as kindness. It was more like noticing what others refused to see. She'd once told her art teacher that drawing helped her see properly, and though the woman smiled, Joan wasn't sure she understood. Her world was a mix of small responsibilities and bigger thoughts. She studied hard, even when exhaustion blurred her eyes. She read quietly while her cousins watched cartoons. She saved the coins from babysitting to buy pencils and sometimes coffee for her aunt. It wasn't much, but it made her feel useful. Most nights, she'd sit by the window, sketching the view outside, the flicker of passing headlights, people talking under the street lamp, the faint sound of jazz from a neighbor's radio. Her drawings were her way of remembering that there was beauty even in struggle. Aunt Patricia often worried that Joan was too quiet. "You spend too much time in your head," she said one evening while folding laundry. "You need to laugh more. Be a teenager." Joan just smiled faintly. "Maybe later." What she didn't say was that laughter felt expensive. It required something light inside, and hers had been heavy for a long time. Still, there was a strength to her quietness, a steadiness that came from surviving things most kids didn't have to. Her teachers described her as thoughtful, though few really knew her. She wasn't popular, but she wasn't invisible either. She was the kind of girl who helped clean the art room after class, who noticed when someone dropped their lunch money, who made space for others to speak before she did. That spring, Boston's chill had started to fade. Joan began spending more time in the city after school, sketching near the busy intersections where businessmen rushed by without seeing the world around them. She loved how the sunlight reflected off the buildings, turning glass into gold. But what caught her attention more were the faces at the bottom of those towers, faces lined with hunger, fatigue, and silence. One of them, though she didn't know it yet, would change her life completely. The first time Joan saw him, she was sketching near the corner of Federal and Franklin Streets. The late afternoon light stretched across the tall buildings, making their glass fronts shimmer like water. Office workers hurried past her, phones in hand, coats flapping in the wind. Amid that motion, one figure didn't move at all. He sat against the wall of an empty storefront on a flattened piece of cardboard. His hair was wild and gray, his beard long enough to hide most of his face. His clothes looked like they had once belonged to someone larger, a faded coat hanging off his narrow frame, sleeves rolled several times over his thin wrists. The thing that struck Joan most were his eyes, pale blue, distant, not searching for pity or attention, just fixed on something invisible beyond the street. He didn't beg. He didn't speak. While others held signs or cups, he simply sat with his back straight and his hands folded in his lap. People streamed around him like water flowing around a stone. To everyone else, he was part of the city's background, another invisible soul in a place too busy to notice. Joan couldn't stop looking. She tried to draw him, but every time she put her pencil down, she found herself studying the quiet stillness that surrounded him instead. There was something about the way he didn't try to be seen that made her see him even more. For 3 days, she watched from across the street after school. She'd sit on a bench with her sketchbook, pretending to work while her eyes drifted toward him. He never moved for long, sometimes adjusting his coat or rubbing his hands together, but he never spoke to anyone either. A few passers-by dropped coins near him, which he gathered only when they had gone. Mostly, people ignored him completely. By the 3rd day, Joan began to wonder about his story. Was he from Boston? Did he have family somewhere? Had he chosen silence, or had life forced it on him? She didn't have answers, only the growing sense that his silence said more than words ever could. On the 4th day, she did something she hadn't planned. After school, she stopped by a small deli, using money she'd earned babysitting her cousins. She bought 2 turkey sandwiches and a bottle of water. She told herself she wasn't doing anything dramatic, just something small, something kind. When she reached the corner, he was there, sitting exactly as before. Joan hesitated a few steps away, her heart thudding faster than she expected. She placed one of the sandwiches on the sidewalk beside him without saying a word. For a long second, he didn't react. Then, slowly, he turned his head. Up close, Joan could see the lines on his face, deep, tired, carved by years of struggle. His eyes met hers, startlingly clear and almost sharp. For a moment, she thought he might refuse it. But then he gave a single nod, slight but unmistakable. She didn't wait for thanks. She just stepped back and walked away, her pulse still racing. She glanced over her shoulder once and saw him lift the sandwich with both hands, as if it were something fragile. That quiet exchange stayed with her all night. She told no one about it. Aunt Patricia was too tired to talk, and her friends at school wouldn't understand. To them, homeless people were just part of the city's noise. But to Joan, that man's silence had weight. The next day, she went back. This time she brought soup from a food truck near the station. Again, she placed it by his side without speaking. Again, he nodded. The same thing happened the day after, and the next. A rhythm began, small, unspoken, steady. She bought food from different places each day, sandwiches, muffins, fruit cups, whatever she could afford from her babysitting money. Sometimes she skipped lunch herself, just to make sure she could bring him something warm. Weeks passed like that. She'd arrive after school, set down the food, and leave. He would acknowledge her with a quiet nod, sometimes a faint lift of his hand, never more. They didn't need words. The silence between them became a kind of language, one of respect and recognition. Over time, she began to notice the little details. The way he carefully folded the wrappers before throwing them away, the way he straightened the small patch of space he occupied, as if still holding on to dignity the world had taken from him. It was like he was fighting to stay human in a place that had stopped treating him that way. To everyone else, Barreto Lozano was invisible. To Joan, he was someone worth seeing. By the second month, the routine had become part of Joan's life. Every day after school, she'd stop by one of the small cafes near Downtown Crossing, buy something warm, and carry it in a paper bag to Federal and Franklin streets. Barreto would be there, always in the same spot, always waiting quietly though never asking. Their exchange lasted less than a minute, but it meant everything to her. When she finally told Keisha, her best friend since 5th grade, the reaction wasn't what Joan expected. "You're feeding some random homeless man?" Keisha said, lowering her voice as they walked home. "Joe, that's crazy. You don't know him. He's probably dangerous. Probably got mental issues or something." Joan's reply was calm. "He's just hungry." Keisha sighed. "Yeah, well, so are half the people in this city. You can't fix that. You're gonna end up on the news for the wrong reason." Joan didn't argue. She knew Keisha meant well. Her friend lived with both parents, had a comfortable home, and didn't spend her nights thinking about people who had nowhere to sleep. Still, the words stuck with Joan like a small thorn. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table doing homework while her Aunt Patricia sorted through bills. The television hummed softly in the background, filling the silence between them. "Where have you been going after school lately?" her aunt asked without looking up. Joan froze for a moment. "Nowhere. Just downtown. I like to draw there." Patricia's eyes lifted. "Drawing's fine. But I heard from Mrs. Ellis you've been talking to someone on the street." "Some man." Joan hesitated. "He's homeless. I just give him food sometimes." Patricia set the bills down slowly. "Baby, no. Absolutely not." "It's nothing bad," Joan said quickly. "He doesn't bother anyone." Her aunt's face softened, but her voice stayed firm. "Joan, listen to me. You can't save everybody. You can barely save yourself right now. There are people who take advantage of kindness. You're young. You don't understand how dangerous that can be." Joan stared down at the table, fingers tracing the edge of a notebook. "He's not dangerous," she whispered. Patricia reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Please, stay away from that man. I know your heart's big. I know you miss your mom and you want to help people like she did. But the world isn't that simple." Joan nodded, but her chest felt tight. Later, lying awake in the dark, she kept hearing her aunt's voice. "You can't save everybody. But wasn't feeding one person something? Wasn't that better than walking past like everyone else? The next day, she told herself she'd stop. She even took a different bus route home. But halfway through the ride, guilt pressed on her so hard she pulled the cord and got off 2 stops early. Her feet carried her back to Federal Street before she could change her mind. Barreto was there, sitting exactly as before, coat pulled tight against the cold. When he saw her, he nodded in quiet recognition, as if he already knew she'd come back. Joan placed the food beside him, no words, just a small smile, and walked away. That silent nod, that small moment of understanding, meant more than any warning or rule. Over the following weeks, Joan noticed things she hadn't before. The way people reacted, or didn't react, to Barreto's presence. Men in suits stepped around him like he was debris. Women clutching handbags crossed to the other side of the street. Some muttered under their breath. Others stared straight ahead as though he wasn't even there. It bothered her deeply. How could a person become invisible while sitting in plain sight? Once she saw a man in a tailored coat drop $1 in front of Barreto without slowing down, as if tossing scraps to a stray animal. Barreto picked up the bill, folded it neatly, and slipped it into his pocket with quiet dignity. Joan sketched that moment later, a figure bent but unbroken against the towering buildings above him. Each visit drew her closer to a question she couldn't shake. Who was he before this? His quiet didn't feel empty. It felt like it carried weight, like he was holding memories too heavy to speak aloud. Sometimes, while she watched him from across the street, she caught herself imagining him in another life, someone who once had a home, maybe even a family, before the world turned away. But she didn't need to know everything. Not yet. It was enough that he existed and that someone finally saw him. For Joan, feeding Barreto wasn't about charity. It was about acknowledgement. In a city full of rushing footsteps and closed eyes, she was determined to stop, to notice, to care. It was the one promise she refused to break. 6 weeks after their quiet routine began, the day started like any other. The streets were slick with leftover rain, and Joan hurried from school, her backpack bouncing against her shoulder. She carried a thermos of soup she'd made from last night's leftovers, still warm enough to bring comfort. But when she turned onto Federal Street, her steps slowed. Barreto wasn't sitting upright like he usually did. He was hunched forward, his body shaking. His hands gripped his knees, and sweat glistened on his forehead despite the cold. His breathing was uneven, sharp gasps between clenched teeth. For the first time, fear gripped Joan. She rushed to him, setting the thermos down beside his feet. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. It took a moment for him to respond. His head lifted slowly, eyes dazed, unfocused. "Barreto," he whispered hoarsely. "My name is Barreto Lozano." Joan knelt beside him. "I'm Joan. Joan Madeline." A faint smile flickered across his face, fragile but real. "You're a good girl, Joan Madeline." The words felt heavy, like they carried meaning beyond simple thanks. She stayed with him until his trembling eased, her hand hovering near his shoulder but never quite touching. She offered him the soup, and though he could barely hold the thermos steady, he managed to drink a little. That day marked a shift between them. From that moment, silence wasn't the only language they shared. In the days that followed, Barreto spoke more. Not much, never long sentences, but enough to turn their quiet ritual into something deeper. Joan found herself talking too, sometimes without thinking. She told him about her art class, her cousin's mischief, the pigeons that always gathered near the fountain outside her school. "They're like people," she said one afternoon, smiling as one strutted by. "Always fighting over crumbs, but they still stick together." Barreto chuckled softly. "They remember kindness. Birds do that." She hadn't expected him to reply, and the warmth in his voice surprised her. Over time, she began noticing details she hadn't before. His accent wasn't local, not exactly foreign, but polished, like someone used to careful words. When he spoke, there was a rhythm to it, deliberate and calm. His sentences hinted at a past that didn't fit the life he lived now. One day, she mentioned a school project about architecture. "We're supposed to draw our favorite building," she said, flipping open her sketchbook to show him a rough sketch of the custom house tower. Barreto leaned closer, studying the lines. "Your perspective is good," he said softly. "But the base, see there, it leans slightly off. That's where the weight sits. Balance matters more than beauty in structures." Joan blinked. "You sound like an architect." He looked away. "I used to know many things. Before." It was the first time he'd hinted at his past, and Joan's curiosity flared. But his tone told her not to press. She simply nodded and adjusted the line as he'd said. Over the next few weeks, pieces of Barreto's former life surfaced in fragments, like clues left by someone who didn't want to be found. He spoke of places she'd only read about in books: Prague in winter, Vienna in spring, the sound of opera echoing through marble halls. Once, when she described a drawing of the Charles River, he smiled faintly. "Water remembers everything," he said. "It carries truth, even when people forget." His words often sounded like poetry, though Joan doubted he meant them that way. She began wondering who he had been before Boston's streets became his home. A traveler? A teacher? Maybe an artist like her. His knowledge felt too vast for someone the world had left behind. Every afternoon, their corner became its own small world, a pause in the rush of the city. Joan talked. Barreto listened. Sometimes he corrected her sketches, other times he just sat quietly, staring at something distant, as though watching a life replay in his mind. Despite his rough appearance, he spoke with a kind of grace that made Joan question everything she'd assumed about people without homes. He never complained, never begged. Even when she offered more than food, a scarf, an extra coat, he refused gently. "You keep it," he'd say. "You need warmth too." One gray afternoon, Joan asked the question that had been sitting in her chest for weeks. "Why are you here, Barreto? On this street, I mean." He took a long breath, his eyes still fixed ahead. "Because sometimes," he said, voice low, "you have to lose everything to see who you really are." The answer left her quiet. It wasn't what she expected, but somehow it felt honest. She didn't ask more. She just sat beside him until dusk, her sketchbook open, pencil tracing lines she didn't understand yet. That night, she wrote his name for the first time on one of her drawings. Barreto Lozano. It felt like naming a secret, one that was only beginning to reveal itself. Joan had grown used to the rhythm of her visits. Same corner, same man, same quiet exchange of gratitude and silence. But winter had crept in harshly this year. The wind cut through her gloves as she walked with a second-hand coat folded neatly over her arm. It wasn't much, a Goodwill find, navy blue with worn buttons, but it was warm, and she hoped Barreto would take it. He was seated against the wall near the old bakery, where the scent of bread sometimes drifted close enough to taunt. His breath fogged in the air, his hands trembling as he tried to sip from a cup of soup she'd brought. Without a word, Joan held out the coat. "It's for you," she said quietly. Barreto looked at it, hesitant, like accepting it would cost him something invisible. But after a moment, he reached for it, his fingers brushing hers, cold, rough, human. As she helped him into the sleeves, something slipped from the inside pocket of his old jacket and fell onto the sidewalk. Joan bent to pick it up before he could stop her. It was a photograph, protected inside a thin plastic cover. The edges were frayed, but the image was clear enough, a younger Barreto, standing beside a dark-haired woman and two children. They were dressed beautifully, sunlight gleaming off a car parked behind them, a mansion visible at the edge of the frame. The man in the photo, clean-shaven, smiling, looked like someone who belonged to another world entirely. Joan glanced up. "Is that your family?" she asked softly. Barretto's expression tightened. His lips parted, but no words came out. His eyes glistened with a pain so deep it felt out of reach. Finally, he whispered, "Was a lifetime ago." Joan didn't press. She simply handed the photograph back. His hands shook as he returned it to the safety of his coat. In the days that followed, she began to notice the details she'd overlooked before. The way he flinched when a police car passed, how his hands trembled even when it wasn't cold, the thin scars that ran across his wrists like faint memories of choices no one should ever have to make. At times, he would drift into moments of stillness so heavy it frightened her, as if his mind had slipped somewhere far away. One afternoon, while she unpacked a thermos of hot chocolate, Barretto murmured something she almost didn't catch. "People I failed," he said, eyes unfocused. "Mistakes I can never undo." Joan looked at him, heart tightening. "You don't have to talk about it," she said. He smiled faintly, or maybe it was just a flicker of sadness. "Talking doesn't change the past," he replied. "It only reminds you how heavy it is." That night, Joan couldn't stop thinking about his words. She lay awake listening to the faint hum of the city outside her window, trying to piece together what kind of life led a man from mansions to park benches. What did he mean by losing everything? Who had he failed? And why did it sound like he'd been carrying that weight for years? 3 days passed with more fragments, broken thoughts that slipped through his silence like clues he didn't mean to share. "I thought I could fix it," he murmured once. "But you can't rebuild trust with promises." Another time, he said, "There's no forgiveness for certain choices. You just keep walking until the road runs out." Each time, Joan wanted to ask more. Each time, she stopped herself. She sensed that pushing too hard would close the door completely. Instead, she began to wonder if there was a way to help him beyond sandwiches and soup. One evening, after dinner, she sat at her aunt's computer, typing Boston homeless resources into the search bar. Names of shelters, outreach programs, and volunteer hotlines filled the screen. She clicked through websites, reading about mental health support, addiction recovery, transitional housing. But each link left her uneasy. What if getting help meant losing him? What if he disappeared into a system that saw numbers instead of faces? Barretto trusted her in a way that seemed fragile, as if a single wrong move could break it. Still, she couldn't ignore the thought that maybe he needed more than food. Maybe kindness wasn't enough. The next time she saw him, his face was pale, the dark circles under his eyes deeper than usual. "You should be somewhere warm," she said. "There are places that help people. Real help." Barretto didn't look at her. "They help those who still believe they deserve it," he said quietly. Joan didn't know what to say. She sat down beside him, tucking her knees to her chest. They sat like that for a long time, two people bound by something invisible but real. As December settled in, the air grew crueler, but Joan kept coming. Each visit felt heavier, as though a truth was pressing closer, waiting to reveal itself. Sometimes Barretto seemed on the edge of saying more, starting a sentence he couldn't finish. "Before all of this," he once said, then stopped, shaking his head. "Before what?" she asked gently. He only whispered, "Before I became someone I couldn't recognize." Those words lingered with her through the night and into the next morning. She found herself sketching him again, his posture, the slump of his shoulders, the haunted patience in his eyes. But in her drawing, she gave him something different: warmth, dignity, a glimmer of peace. It was her quiet rebellion against the way the world saw him. 3 days later, she brought another cup of soup, but Barreto didn't seem hungry. He sat staring at his hands, lips moving in silent thought. "It's almost time," he said softly. "For what?" Joan asked. He didn't answer. Something in his tone chilled her, not in fear, but in recognition that whatever he carried was about to surface. The air between them felt weighted with all the words left unsaid. As she walked home that evening, the city lights blurred in her eyes. She didn't know why, but she could feel it. Something was coming. Something that would change everything she thought she knew about the man on the corner. The air felt colder than usual that morning. Joan's hands were wrapped around the handles of a small grocery bag, steam still curling from the top of the soup container. She'd been up early, waiting for the bread to finish toasting before packing it, just the way Barreto liked it, slightly burnt on the edges. She was humming softly as she turned the last corner toward his spot near the bakery. But something was wrong. Flashing blue and red lights painted the walls. 2 police cars were parked across the street. A third blocked the sidewalk entirely. Joan stopped. Her pulse quickened as she spotted a small crowd gathering, commuters slowing down, curious faces illuminated by phone screens. In the middle of it all, 3 officers stood around a man with his hands raised, his thin frame trembling, his coat half-buttoned. Barreto. For a second, her mind refused to understand. The kind, quiet man she'd been bringing soup to for weeks was standing between 2 uniformed officers, his face ashen, eyes wide with a look of someone who'd been waiting for this moment far too long. "Sir, don't move," one officer warned, keeping his hand near his holster. "I'm not resisting," Barreto said, voice barely audible. "I'm done running." A few steps away stood a woman in an expensive wool coat, mid-50s, tall, her hair pulled into a flawless twist. There was something steely in her stance, the kind of composure that comes from anger carried too long. Her eyes burned into Barreto with years of bitterness. Joan froze, clutching the paper bag to her chest. "That's him," the woman said, her tone clipped and shaking at the same time. "That's Barreto Lozano, the man who destroyed my family." Joan blinked, confused. "Destroyed your family?" The woman turned at the sound of her voice, studying her, a teenage girl in a thrifted jacket, holding food she'd meant to give away. "You know this man?" she demanded. "Do you have any idea what he's done?" Joan opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her grip loosened, the bag slipping from her hands. The container hit the pavement with a soft crack, soup bleeding into the snow. "Ma'am," one of the officers said to the woman, "we'll handle it from here. Please step back." But Margaret Hartwell, Joan would hear the name moments later, didn't move. Her gaze stayed locked on Barreto, the fury in her voice sharp enough to draw the crowd in closer. "Handle it," she snapped. "You don't know who this man is. He's a thief, a liar. He stole $3.2 million from investors, including my husband. My husband who took his own life because of what this man did." Joan's chest tightened. The words hit her like stones. Barreto didn't look up. His shoulders sagged as if the weight he'd carried had finally crushed him. "Mr. Lozano," the lead officer said, unfolding a document, "you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit securities violations. You have the right to remain silent." Joan barely heard the rest. The world had narrowed to the space between Barreto and her, the silent recognition in his eyes, the apology written across his face. Her mind raced. Fraud? Embezzlement? $3 million? None of it made sense. She wanted to run forward, to tell them they were mistaken, that Barreto wasn't dangerous, that he barely spoke above a whisper. But her feet wouldn't move. Margaret turned toward her again. "You think you know him," she said bitterly. You think he's some poor soul the world forgot? He's not. He's a monster who ruined lives. He took everything from good, decent families. He destroyed my husband." Joan shook her head slowly, her throat tight. "I know he's hungry," she said quietly. "I know he's human." The woman let out a short, bitter laugh, the kind that comes from pain too deep to disguise. "Human? Tell that to the people who lost their homes. Tell that to the parents who couldn't pay their kids' tuition because of him. Tell that to the man who put a gun to his head because he couldn't face the shame of losing everything. That was my husband. His name was Charles Hartwell. And this man, smiled at us while he stole from us." Joan's eyes darted between them. Barretto's lips moved, but no sound came out. Margaret stepped closer, her voice breaking. "He was our financial advisor. Everyone trusted him, neighbors, friends, retirees. He promised steady returns, showed us documents, updates, reports. We thought he was brilliant. But it was all lies. A scheme built on other people's savings. When the money dried up, he vanished. The investigation started too late. The funds were gone, the accounts closed, and so was my husband's life." Her voice cracked on the last word. Joan felt dizzy. The world tilted slightly, like the sidewalk had shifted beneath her. Barretto finally spoke, eyes fixed on the ground. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he said, voice trembling. "I know sorry means nothing. But I am." She flinched at the sound of his voice, as if hearing it reopened an old wound. "Don't you dare say my name," she hissed. "You had years to apologize, years while I buried my husband, while I sold our home to pay debts you created. You don't get to feel sorry now." Joan's breath came shallow and fast. She wanted to understand, to fit these two versions of Barretto together, the man who sat quietly feeding pigeons and the one who had allegedly destroyed so many lives. "Miss," one officer said, noticing her frozen on the edge of the scene, "you should step back. This area's restricted." Joan took a slow step backward, her legs shaking. Barretto turned his head slightly, searching the crowd until his eyes met hers. For a moment, everything else fell away, the flashing lights, the shouts, the bitter cold. His gaze held hers, filled with apology, sorrow, and something else, relief. As if being found was both punishment and mercy. The officers began to guide him toward the car. He didn't resist. Margaret followed for a few steps, her voice breaking again. "You ruined us, Barretto. You ruined everything." He paused, glancing over his shoulder. "I ruined myself first," he said quietly. Joan swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes. Margaret noticed her again, her tone softening slightly but still edged with disbelief. "You've been helping him? Feeding him?" Joan nodded faintly. "Why?" the woman asked, almost to herself. "Why help a man like that?" Joan's voice wavered. "Because no one else did." Margaret stared at her for a long time, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. Confusion, maybe even envy, at the simple mercy she couldn't summon. Barretto was placed in the back of the police car. The door closed with a final, heavy sound. The flashing lights reflected off the wet pavement, turning the snow pink and blue. Joan stood there, her breath fogging the air, watching as the car pulled away and disappeared into traffic. For a moment, she felt hollow, like the city had swallowed both of them whole. The man she'd known wasn't who she thought he was. Every act of kindness, every shared silence, now felt like a thread tied to something broken. But even as her world tilted, one truth stayed with her. Whatever he had done, she had seen him as a person first. And maybe, just maybe, that still mattered. The snow had started to fall harder, light flakes catching on Joan's eyelashes as the police guided Barreto toward the waiting car. He didn't resist, didn't speak. His head was bowed, his steps unsteady. The small crowd began to disperse, murmuring fragments of conversation, words like fraud, millions, scam. Joan stood rooted to the spot, her breath clouding in the cold air. She wanted to walk away, but something inside her refused. Barreto turned slightly, his eyes searching until they found her again. "Please," he said to the nearest officer, his voice trembling. "Let me explain to the girl. Just 1 minute. Please." The officer hesitated. "Sir, we have procedures." 1 minute, Barreto repeated softly. "That's all I need." The lead officer, older, with lines of fatigue carved around his eyes, sighed. "Make it quick." He motioned for Joan to step closer but stayed within earshot. Joan approached slowly, her heart hammering. Barreto's wrists were cuffed, the metal biting into his thin skin. Up close, he looked smaller, like all the air had gone out of him. "Everything she said," he began, his voice rough, "it's true." Joan felt the words land like cold stones in her stomach. "I did those things," he continued. "Every one of them." Her lips parted, but she couldn't form a response. Barreto swallowed hard. "I started honest. I really did. I worked for a firm downtown, handled portfolios for small investors, teachers, retirees, families saving for college. I was good at it. They trusted me." He paused, closing his eyes briefly. "Then one bad investment wiped out a client's savings. I panicked. I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed. I moved money around, just a little at first. Told myself I'd put it back when the next deal came through. But it didn't. So I borrowed more from another account to cover it. That worked for a while, until it didn't. One lie became 10, then 100. Joan's throat tightened. "You were running a scam?" Barreto nodded weakly. "A scheme. Not at the start, but it turned into one. I convinced myself I was buying time, that I was protecting people's futures. I thought I could still fix it if I just worked harder. But I was lying to myself. I watched the numbers grow, watched the hole deepen, and I kept smiling at those same people every day." He looked down, his hands trembling. By the time it collapsed, millions were gone. Retirement funds, college savings, everything. I had destroyed lives. People who trusted me. People like Margaret's husband. The weight of his confession hung heavy in the air. The city noises seemed to fade. Just the wind and the hum of idling engines filled the silence. "My wife found out first," Barreto said quietly. "She begged me to turn myself in. I couldn't. I was a coward. I told myself I was protecting her and the kids by leaving. Truth is, I was protecting myself from shame." Joan could see the pain in his face, the way his jaw clenched, the tears he refused to shed. "They changed their names," he went on. "Filed for a restraining order. I can't blame them. They needed to be free of me. The last time I saw them was 5 years ago. That photograph you saw, that's all I have left of them. Taken a year before everything fell apart." He looked up at her, eyes glassy but steady. "I used to be a man who wore suits worth more than this whole street. Now I can't even look at my reflection without feeling sick. I thought about ending it more times than I can count. But I couldn't do that either. So I walked away from everything. No ID, no name, no past. Just silence." Joan swallowed hard, tears welling up. "You've been living out here all this time?" He nodded. "I wandered for years. Slept under bridges, in shelters, anywhere that would let me disappear. I told myself this was my punishment, to live among those I used to ignore, to lose everything I'd ever built, to feel hunger, cold, shame, all the things I made others feel in a different way. The officer shifted behind them. Time's almost up. Barretto's voice grew softer, almost a whisper. I stayed in Boston because I couldn't keep running. I was tired. Every night, I'd see their faces, the people I ruined. The investors, the families, my wife, my children. I thought maybe if I stayed long enough, someone would find me. Someone like Margaret. Or maybe justice would catch up. He looked at Joan again, a faint, broken smile touching his lips. But then you showed up. Joan blinked through her tears. Me? Yes, he said, nodding slightly. You with your quiet kindness. You didn't ask for anything. You just saw me. No judgment, no pity, just humanity. You reminded me what it felt like to be treated as a person again. He paused, searching her face. Every time you handed me food, I wanted to tell you the truth. I wanted to say, don't waste your kindness on me. But I couldn't. Because your kindness was the only thing keeping me alive. Joan's tears spilled over. You lied to everyone, she said softly. But you didn't lie to me. You just didn't tell me. He nodded. I wanted to protect you from who I was. From what I'd done. But maybe you deserved to know sooner. The officer gestured toward the car. We need to go. Barretto looked at him, then back at Joan. One last thing, he said quietly. The officer gave a curt nod. 1 minute. Barretto took a deep breath, his voice steadier than before. Joan Madeline, listen to me. Don't let my mistakes make you stop seeing people. Don't let what I did turn your heart cold. That kindness in you, protect it. It's rarer than you know. Joan's chest tightened as she struggled to speak. I don't know how to feel right now. I believed in you. I know, he said. And that's what hurts the most. You believed in someone who didn't deserve it. But for what it's worth, you made me believe again too, even if only for a little while. The officer touched his arm. That's it, Mr. Lozano. Barretto turned toward the car. As he stepped forward, Joan blurted out, Barretto. He stopped. Will they put you in prison? She asked, her voice breaking. He turned his head just enough to meet her gaze. They should, he said softly. It's where I belong. Joan shook her head through her tears. You don't belong nowhere. For the first time in months, Barretto smiled, faint, weary but real. Maybe not anymore. The car door closed behind him, and the vehicle began to pull away. The snow fell thicker now, muffling the city's noise. Joan stood there, alone, watching until the lights disappeared into the distance. The world around her blurred, cars passing, voices echoing, but inside, everything was still. She didn't know whether to feel betrayed, heartbroken, or grateful. All she knew was that she had seen the man behind the story. Not the headline. Not the crime. The man who once made terrible choices and spent the rest of his life trying to live with them. As she turned toward home, Joan whispered into the cold, I'll protect it, Barretto. I promise. Her words vanished into the wind, but somehow, it felt like he heard them. The night air still carried the sharp sting of police sirens when Joan stood motionless at the corner of Federal and Franklin. Barretto was already in the back of the cruiser, his head bowed, hands cuffed, the thin line of his shoulders trembling beneath the flashing red and blue. Margaret Hartwell, her elegant coat pulled tight around her, approached Joan slowly. Her voice, when it came, was weary rather than cruel. You seem like a good kid, she said. Don't waste your goodness on people like him. Joan didn't flinch. She was pale, her fingers gripping the brown paper bag she never got to hand over. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "I'm sorry for what happened to your family," she said. "I really am. But he's still a person." Margaret's lips parted, ready to argue, but the force in Joan's tone stopped her. The girl's words didn't carry defiance. They carried understanding, grief even. It disarmed her. For a brief second, Margaret's polished mask cracked. She saw not a naive teenager, but someone standing in the wreckage of something she didn't cause, trying to make sense of it all. Margaret exhaled, her eyes softening. "My husband, he was a good man," she said after a long silence. "When Barreto's scheme collapsed, he lost everything. Every cent of his pension, every bit of his dignity. He thought he'd failed us. He didn't survive the shame." Joan's heart clenched. She saw the exhaustion in the woman's face, the lines around her eyes carved not by vanity, but by years of anger and sleepless nights. "Will justice bring him back?" Joan asked softly. "Will it heal what's broken?" Margaret's gaze fell to the pavement. For a moment, her voice faltered. "No," she said finally. "But maybe it'll help me stop hurting." The two stood in silence, broken only by the sound of engines fading down Tremont Street. The cruiser carrying Barreto disappeared around the corner. Joan wanted to run after it, to shout something. She didn't know what, but her feet felt nailed to the ground. Over the next few days, she moved through life in a fog. At school, her friends chattered about exams and concerts, but Joan barely spoke. She replayed every moment with Barreto in her mind, his quiet thank yous, his stories about Vienna, his trembling hands when he said her name. None of it matched the image of a man who could destroy lives. Still, truth had its own gravity. It didn't care about kindness or intention. It pulled everything into its orbit. A week later, Joan visited the courthouse. She didn't go inside, she couldn't, but she spoke with a clerk who told her Barreto had pled guilty. No trial. No excuses. He was cooperating with prosecutors to recover what little could be returned. His sentence would be reduced for his honesty, though it would still mean years behind bars. That night, Joan sat at her small desk under the dim glow of her bedside lamp and wrote a letter. She began 3 times before finding the words. "Dear Mr. Lozano, I don't know if this will reach you. I'm angry and sad and confused. You lied by not telling me who you were, but you never lied with your eyes. When you thanked me for the food, it felt real. I can't visit you. I can't pretend what you did was okay. But I wanted you to know, those meals mattered. Maybe not to you at first, but they did to me. You once told me I reminded you what it meant to be human. Maybe I needed to be reminded too, that people can be both broken and kind. Joan Madeline." She folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and addressed it to the detention center. Whether he ever read it, she never found out. But writing it loosened something inside her, something that had been tightening since that day on the corner. 6 months later, Joan had grown quieter, but not smaller. She spent her weekends volunteering at a small shelter 2 blocks from where she first met Barreto. She served food, folded blankets, listened when people talked, and didn't ask when they didn't. She met others with stories that blurred the lines between guilt and grief, men who'd lost jobs and never recovered, women escaping things they couldn't name. Some had done terrible things, others had simply been caught in the wrong current. Each one reminded her that life rarely divided people cleanly into good and bad. Her Aunt Patricia noticed the change. Joan didn't argue as much anymore. She thought longer before she spoke. Her sketches had shifted too, less about faces, more about hands, gestures, small kindnesses in motion. One crisp morning, Joan returned to the same corner where everything began. The city was waking, coffee carts, traffic lights flickering from red to green. A new figure sat where Barreto once did, an elderly black woman wrapped in a faded scarf, her hands trembling around an empty cup. Joan crouched beside her and offered a sandwich and a small cup of tea. The woman looked up, startled. "For me?" she asked. Joan smiled faintly. "Yeah, for you." As the woman thanked her softly, Joan's gaze drifted across the street where the shadows of passing people stretched and disappeared. She thought about Barreto in his cell, about Margaret trying to let go of her anger, about her own promise to keep seeing people, even when it hurt. She knew now that kindness didn't erase wrongdoing, but it kept the world from turning completely cold. Compassion wasn't about forgiving everything, it was about refusing to let cruelty decide who you became. As she stood to leave, sketchbook tucked under her arm, she looked once more at the woman eating quietly on the curb. Maybe that's what compassion is, Joan thought. Not ignoring someone's wrongs, but not letting their wrongs be all you see. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the city and the hum of morning traffic. Joan turned toward home, her steps steady, her gaze forward, still looking when others looked away. If this story touched you, if it made you pause and think about how kindness and justice can live in the same breath, share your thoughts below. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. We truly love hearing your voices. Don't forget to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss the next story. Tomorrow, we bring you another powerful journey that will challenge how you see people, forgiveness, and second chances. Thank you for being here, for watching, and for believing that stories like this still matter. Your support helps us keep telling them, one story, one lesson, one act of compassion at a time.